Welcome to my beginning watercolor tip 22, which is part 5 of my moisture content series, Scraping and Lifting. In this video, I'll use an exercise just as I did in parts 2 through 4 to demonstrate scraping and lifting under various moisture conditions. Just as I did in the previous exercises, I'll be working with saturated paper, damp paper, and dry paper. Unlike the previous exercises, I'm not going to wet the entire area. It's just the shape that I'm painting with my paintbrush that will have the moisture content referred to at the top of the column. So in this instance, I'm painting tree-like shapes with my brush, and I'm doing it with a loaded brush, so these shapes have a saturated moisture content. I'm going to take this plastic scraper and I'm going to scrape this within this shape to try and give the indication of a tree trunk. I'm going to zoom in and we can look at the result. I didn't get the effect that I was after. Instead of getting a light mark to give the indication of a tree trunk, I actually got a dark linear mark. It gives the suggestion of a trunk, but it's not the result I was after. I was trying to scrape away paint and leave a light linear shape. Because this shape is saturated with water loaded with pigment, when I scraped it with a plastic tool, it actually just flowed right back in to the space I scraped and actually made it darker. So as you can see by this example, if you want to scrape away paint, working on saturated paper is unlikely to give you the result that you're after. I'm going to make another shape just as I did above, and once again I'm using a brush that's fully loaded with water and pigment, and this is going to be a saturated shape. And this time I'm going to attempt to make a similar mark by using lifting instead of scraping. Now I'm going to come in with a damp brush and I'm going to use it to lift some of the pigment off the surface. In doing so, it gives me a lighter mark, but it's still fairly dull. So it's a technique you could use if you want a subtle lifting of pigment. So even though I've lifted some of the moisture away, there's still enough in this saturated paper to give that more of a soft edge than a hard edge. I'm going to make another shape at the bottom that again is going to be saturated, and I'm going to show how you can use a saturated brush. In this case, I'm going to use clear water to almost wash out some of this pigment that I've put down. Because it is saturated, it's still floating around. And if I want, I can take a saturated brush, and I'm actually using clear water to almost wipe away the pigment that I put down. So it does leave a lighter mark in the shape I put down, but I'm not necessarily lifting as much as I'm washing away with a very damp brush. And you can see that I'm not really getting a crisp line. There's some bleeding off to the side because the whole shape is very saturated and very fluid. You can see as I zoom in how that clear water started to blossom off into the other areas of the shape because it was so saturated. Now I'm going to continue my exercise, and I'm going to make a similar shape, but I'm going to let it dry a little bit so that it's damp. So the shape right now is saturated just as my shape to the left was. However, I'm going to let it rest just a little bit, and then I'll come in and use my scraping tool. So I let it go till it has a bit of a sheen. It's when it loses some of the gloss and starts to take on a slight sheen. I've let this dry a little bit. Now I'm going to take my plastic scraping tool and scrape into the moist shape and make some of these light linear marks. It's still a little fluid in some areas, but it's hard to get that consistent moisture content across the whole shape sometimes. And if you let it go too far, it'll dry and you won't be able to move the pigment. And I'm not really removing paper as much as I said, I'm moving pigment. So it's pushing the pigment along the paper, and there's not enough moisture for more to flow back in where I've pushed it out of the way. And the result is a linear mark. You can see as I zoom in the lighter linear marks that have been left by my scraping, and that's the result that I'm after when I'm using this technique. I'm going to paint a second shape here, and it's saturated. I'm going to let it rest a little bit, and then I'm going to come in with a damp brush as I did in the first column and attempt to lift out some of the paint to leave the lighter linear marks that I'm after. So I've let that dry a little bit. It's still damp, and now I'm coming in with a damp brush, and you can see that it's lifted off some of the paint and left a light linear mark that's more distinct than lifting off on the saturated paper. As I zoom in, you can see by lifting on the damp paper I was able to make a more distinct mark than I was on the saturated paper, and it left not only the lighter linear mark, but in a few areas I was able to drag that pigment off onto the white of the paper and give the suggestion of that shape continuing on a dark against light. So I have a light against dark, and then where it goes off the edge it becomes a dark against light shape. Because the paper is still damp, it still has a bit of softness to the edge. I'm going to make two marks towards the bottom of the paper, and I'm going to let them dry a little bit till they have the sheen that I'm looking for. And then I'm going to scrape across both shapes, and then I'm going to lift across both shapes. I'm picking up that bead of water because it's very saturated. I don't want that to blossom. So right now I'm just going to let that dry a little bit. It's dried so that it has the sheen I'm looking for. And now I'm going to take my scraping tool and I'm going to scrape across both shapes with the edge of the scraping tool. And you can see how it drags that color as I make these marks. It's a good way to continue that line, and you can see how you have the light shape, linear shape over the dark shape, and then it drags that color and makes a dark mark over the white. And now I'm using a damp brush and I'm lifting, and you can see I can drag that pigment. So this is a technique I like to use with trees and some different things. I use it when I'm working with florals too. I make some linear grassy shapes, and as I drag my brush across a dark shape that may be a leaf or something, I can drag that pigment off the actual edge of that shape, and it gives an interesting continuation of that line, and it can be a very effective technique. Here I've zoomed in, you can see the result I got. And now if this were a fence and I was trying to give the suggestion of a tree in front of it, you can see how effective that would be. By dragging the pigment from one shape to the other and continuing it, it gives the impression that it's one continuous linear shape, such as a tree, in front of what could be a fence. And although these marks are similar, remember the ones to the left were achieved by scraping, and the ones to the right were achieved by using a damp brush to lift and drag pigment. Now I'm going to move on to the last column, and here I'm going to work with lifting on dry paper. So I'm going to paint all my shapes just as I did in the first two columns, and then I'm going to dry all the shapes completely, and then I'll come back in and I'll do my scraping and my lifting. I put my final shape in here, and I'm going to pick up that water, and now I'm going to dry it completely. My paper has dried completely, and now I'm going to take my plastic scraper and attempt to scrape some linear marks. And as you can see, the plastic tool on dry paper has no impact. What I can do if I choose to, if I want to make a linear mark on dry paper, is use a razor blade. And in this instance, I'm not moving paint as I do when I scrape with a plastic tool. I'm actually removing paint, scraping away paint and paper. So I'm scratching the surface of the paper, and it makes a fine mark. If I want a wider mark, I have to change the angle of my blade. But if you change it too much, it gets a very irregular scrape, and it doesn't necessarily look very clean. As I zoom in, you can see the white linear marks that were made by scratching away the paint and some of the paper. Personally, this isn't a technique that I really use, but it is an effective method that many people do use, and it does give you some fine linear marks if that's the result you're looking for. This technique can accomplish that. Next, I'm going to take my damp brush and I'm going to lift to make some of the linear marks that I'm after. And you can see how I blot it. Because it's dry, I'm not going to remove paint all around it. It's just going to be moist in the area where the brush goes. So I can take my damp brush and apply the moisture, and then I can blot it with a Kleenex to help lift some of the pigment. And you can see that the mark that this leaves gives a crisper edge than the other two situations where you have saturated and damp paper. And you can also see how I'm able to drag that pigment off, as I was showing, to give that continuation of that linear shape. As I zoom in, you can see that the edge is a little bit cleaner than when doing this on damp or saturated paper. Now I'm going to go to the bottom two marks, and I'm going to take a razor blade and scratch, and you can see how this will give me the white linear marks I'm after, but it doesn't give me the continuation. And you can see some of that paper and paint coming off. It doesn't give me the continuation of that line like the other techniques that I'm using. So now I'm going to come in with the damp brush, and I'm going to lift, I'm going to drag that pigment, and you can see how I get that continuation of that shape. If that's the result you want to get, this is a good technique to do that. I'm going to make a couple more marks here. Now in this one, I don't want the continuation of the line, so I'm watching where my brush goes, and I'm just moistening the paper where I've made the shape, the dark shape, so I don't have that continuation of the line because I didn't drag the paint. I'm just blotting off the moist area where I put it on the shape. Now I did that here on the bottom. On the top, I'm going to drag it off, so you can see if I drag it, I'm going to get that continuation. And the reason I can blot this is because the rest of the paper is dry and the rest of that shape's dry, whereas in the damp and saturated I didn't do that because I would have lifted off the paint in the shape because it's wet. Now I'm just going to do a quick review of the exercise. So I did this on saturated, damp, and dry paper. I started with a saturated shape where I tried to scrape a linear mark into the shape, but because there's so much moisture, it just filled right back in and actually left a dark mark. If I worked on the damp paper with my my scraping tool, I was able to leave a lighter linear mark. And on the dry paper, the plastic tool is ineffective, and I had to use a razor blade. Now, working with saturated paper, I was able to use my brush to do some lifting, and you can see the result here where I actually use clear water, a saturated brush, to actually wash away some of the paint. Now if I come back to the damp paper and I go to the lifting, you can see I was able to lift and it left a stronger mark than on the saturated paper, but it still has a little bit of soft edge. And you can see my marks here at the bottom. Again, working on damp paper, scraping and lifting to the right. And there I was able to illustrate the continuation of the line from shape to shape because I was dragging pigment. Now on the dry, you can see here where I was doing the lifting, I got a crisper edge than I did on the damp or the saturated paper, and I was able to get some continuation of those lines, except where I was using the razor blade to scratch. There's no continuation. And also you can see that I have the continuation where I want, and where I didn't want it, I didn't drag my brush off the darker shape. And that concludes my video on scraping and lifting, part 5 in my series on moisture content. This was going to be the last part in this series. However, because of some of the questions that I've received, I've decided to add a part 6. In part 6, we'll talk about blossoms and backwash. I hope you found part 5 on scraping and lifting helpful, and be sure to look for part 6, which will talk about blossoms and backwash. Don't forget to check out Rick Surowicz Watercolor Friends and Subscribers on Facebook, and if you have questions about my materials, you can always go to the studio page on my website, rsurowitzart.com, and if you have specific questions, you can email me at contact@rsurowitzart@gmail.com. Thanks for watching.